It's a pleasure to be here. I thank Iowa City Hospice for the opportunity, and Hills Bank, and the Channel 4 as well. So my name is Emily Logan. I am an assistant professor at Kirkwood Community College. And the way I got involved with researching the topic of compassion fatigue was through an opportunity at Kirkwood called the Endowed Chair. We at Kirkwood do mostly teaching. We don't do a lot of research like a lot of university professors do. And so this was a unique opportunity for me to do about a year-long research project related to burnout, compassion fatigue, and related constructs. Some of you have maybe heard of traumatic stress. I looked at something called secondary traumatic stress, also vicarious trauma. So as we move through talking about compassion fatigue, know that this is a very large topic that has a lot of different concepts related, and so we're really just touching the surface today of compassion fatigue and what that means for caregivers. So today, my presentation will focus on these 4 objectives. First, I want to explain what compassion fatigue is and what the impact on it can be for professionals and non-professional caregivers. Next, we want to look at what are some of the symptoms and signs of compassion fatigue. Next, how can we combat compassion fatigue? What are strategies, techniques, tools to work against that and to enhance our compassion satisfaction and our resilience? And then finally, hopefully you'll walk away today with some very concrete ideas to create a plan or create a strategy for enhancing your compassion satisfaction or resilience. So, compassion fatigue is a concept that relates to caregiving. So some of you come from professional roles of caregiving that also might demand unpredictable hours, high caseloads, working with clients who've experienced significant loss or trauma. Likewise, many of us who are professional caregivers are also personal caregivers. We're parents, we're children, siblings, friends, and also many people in our personal lives will look toward professional caregivers as, oh, we should ask so-and-so because that's what they do for their job. And we end up landing in a variety of caregiving roles. And that is in no way to minimize the experience of people who do caregiving in a non-professional manner. Often those individuals, because of their personality, their traits, how they spend their time, are identified by their friends, their family, and community as somebody they can turn to because they know of that person's past or current caregiving experience. So I want to be clear here that compassion fatigue is not just particular to professionals or to personal caregiving. It can be and is related to both. So burnout, particular to caregivers, is a simple way of understanding compassion fatigue. You're tired. You're physically tired and you're emotionally tired. You feel exhausted. And it's often a very difficult exhaustion to put your finger on because you might be thinking, well, I don't know why I'm just so worn out all the time, and why don't I have any motivation to do this or that, or why am I not sleeping well? And so it can be, it can creep up on us. It can be hard to put our finger on. There are 3 symptoms that, according to research by Figley in 2001, were identified as very common related to compassion fatigue. There's some other symptoms we're going to get to later as well. But one is intrusion. You find yourself thinking about caregiving tasks, caregiving roles in times when you really wouldn't have to be thinking about it. You're at the movie theater, you're trying to enjoy a film, and you have thoughts coming in about your caregiving responsibilities. You're trying to read a book, you're trying to go on a vacation. You're trying to spend time maybe on a walk or relaxing with grandchildren or whatever that looks like, and you can't be in the moment. You have intrusive thoughts about the caregiving responsibilities and roles you have. The next item is avoidance. So it's very typical for a person who's very fatigued in terms of their compassion to just try to avoid caregiving tasks. And oftentimes, if one tries to avoid them, then there's guilt related to the avoidance. So there's this cycle of, well, I just don't feel like dealing with this today, or, oh my gosh, I just, I don't want to take another phone call, or I don't want to deal with another question or another appointment. And then we end up feeling guilty because we feel that way, that desire, or the actual behavior of avoidance. And then finally, hyperarousal. Hyperarousal relates to that feeling that you're on edge, that you're anxious, that you're kind of waiting for the next thing to happen, or you're waiting for the next crisis, and it's very easy to relax. It's almost a constant state of tension. So if you think about how the idea of like how hot does an engine run, it's like your engine's running hot all the time. And so it's very difficult to be present and be in the moment when you're doing things that are relaxing, when you're trying to sleep at night, when you're trying to maybe just enjoy a nice meal. Any of those things become very difficult because you're so revved up. So our time is a valuable resource. One of the things that a lot of caregivers experience is that their time is actually their most valuable resource. And there's just not enough of it. This is so true for individuals with multiple caregiving roles, that you're trying to give to your children, to your parents, to your work, to your spouse, to your friends, to your church, to whatever that might be. And you just don't have the time you think you need to do it all. And again, if you feel like time is my most valuable resource and I don't have enough time, you might start cutting out activities that you know could be helpful, beneficial, are things to do to take care of yourself. But you think, well, I don't have time to go for a walk today. I don't have time to get 8 hours of sleep because I am doing these things. So there is an ebb and flow to the experience of compassion fatigue. So it's important to know that just because you experience compassion fatigue doesn't mean you're going to always experience it. And also, if you haven't experienced it yet, it doesn't mean that you're not going to. One of the questions that I tried to look into is how common is compassion fatigue? Like really statistically, how often do helpers, caregivers report compassion fatigue? And the most reliable research I found across the board said almost everybody. It is nearly a universal phenomenon. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, why aren't we talking about this then, right? If nearly all of us experience it, why aren't we talking about this every day? Because if we haven't experienced it yet, we have a high likelihood of experiencing it. If we are experiencing it, how can we reach out to our community, our family, our friends, our colleagues, whomever, and get some support? And if we've worked through compassion fatigue and we feel like we're on the other side, at least for the time being, what wisdom can we offer to others? What support can we offer to others? What are we practicing in our daily lives that we need to make sure we're continuing to practice so that we stay as healthy and well as possible? I was listening to a podcast on my way here today, and one of the analogies that was used regarding caregiving was that when you're flying in an airplane, and they warn you about all the things they warn you about when you're getting ready to take off. Yes, it's like the same thing we hear all the time, and most of us don't pay attention anymore, right? If that mask falls down from the ceiling and you are with somebody that you are caregiving for, which mask are you directed to put on first? Yours. I think that has implications for this topic. So, even healthy helpers, caregivers, with effective self-care strategies can experience compassion fatigue, especially when we are overloaded, when we have people in our lives or we ourselves have experienced trauma, or if we or people in our lives are experiencing crisis. So life happens, right? Just because we're caregiving doesn't mean that everything else is smooth. A lot of times in our life there are multiple things that are stressors. And so when that gets to the point where we feel the experience of being overloaded, we feel a sense of crisis, that our stress level is higher than normal, that's when we become especially vulnerable to compassion fatigue. I want to introduce you to a concept called the Empathic Bridge. I think this is something that I came up with. I've tried to Google it and find ideas. But let me tell you what it means to me and why I think it relates to compassion fatigue. When we work with people, especially in caregiving roles. We need to offer care, empathy, understanding, support. So I have a social work background, and if some of you have ever intersected with the social service community or happen to be professionals, you know that something that we get just inundated with is treating clients with empathy, right? Using empathy. And empathy is the experience of trying to imagine as if you were that other person. So it's trying to imagine life in their shoes. My guess is that if you are here today, if you are watching this video, you know what empathy means because you do it every day. Probably with people who aren't just your family, your friends. You probably extend empathy to clients, to other individuals, because many of us are dosed with a lot of empathy. We're like, that's who we are. And we're natural caregivers because we can easily see the world through other people's eyes. But being exposed to pain, distress, hurt, fear, all those emotions that we may see in those for whom we're giving care, that affects us. We start to absorb it. And what begins to happen is that we start to carry some of that pain, that distress, that fear, whatever those emotions might be. And so one of the questions that you can't help but ask yourselves is, if I go across that empathic bridge and I want to extend empathy to those to whom I give care, should I just stop doing that? Will that help me not become vulnerable to compassion fatigue? How much of myself am I losing as I extend empathy to others? Well, I'm a champion for empathy, so I would say absolutely not. That's not the answer. That's not the answer. The world needs us as caregivers to do the jobs that we're doing, the professional and non-professional roles. So I would say to you, no, the answer is not to pull back, not to isolate, not to use that wonderful gift of empathy to people that we care about, to people we care for. So then, what's the answer? So what do we do? Well, I want to talk about the term resilience. Resilience is a term that's gained considerable popularity. There's been many types of research across disciplines that have looked at what is resilience and how do people manifest resilience. Essentially, what resilience is when individuals, families, communities exhibit competence despite challenge. It's when we rise above. It's when we keep going. It's when we're the little engine that could, right? It's when we manage to keep going despite significant adversity. So resilience is very connected to the social work perspective of strengths-based perspective, which is that we can focus on an individual, a family, a community's strengths to see how do they demonstrate resilience, competence, the ability to keep going, and how do we maximize those strengths and not fall victim to compassion fatigue. So we want to look at how do we enhance, how do we foster, how do we practice resilience in such a way that it protects us from compassion fatigue or helps alleviate compassion fatigue. So another term that I would offer you as well is compassion satisfaction. And compassion satisfaction is the sense of reward that you get from caregiving. If you give care, if you are a caregiver, it's probably because at some level you feel a sense of meaning and a sense of purpose related to the caregiving. Oftentimes it's a sense of duty. You know, that's true too, but most of us feel like we're doing something to make an individual or a family or the world better off by the service we're providing. So compassion satisfaction is essentially the other end of the teeter-totter with compassion fatigue. Compassion satisfaction is when you feel a sense of reward, you feel a sense of balance, a sense of meaning and purpose. But when compassion fatigue increases, oftentimes our sense of compassion satisfaction decreases. So there's an inverse relationship here. A lot of us get into caregiving roles because we're natural helpers. We have natural personality traits or interests that lend us to that role. But even we need to look at, where is that balance? So there are a lot of pieces of information on this slide, and we could spend a whole week talking about each one of these strategies or ideas related to compassion fatigue. In the interest of time, I'm going to walk through a few items with you, and I'm certainly open to questions at the end of the presentation if you'd like to follow up on any one of these items. The research regarding resilience talks a lot about risk factors and protective factors, and I want to just introduce this idea to you. Risk factors are those things that put us at risk for negative conditions: mental health, physical health, diminished role function, etc. Okay? Protective factors are those things that protect us from negative functioning, problems, stress, crisis. So we each have a set of protective factors and risk factors that can change over time. Things that were protective factors and risk factors for us as children may be different than the protective factors and risk factors we've experienced into adulthood, into later life. They too ebb and flow. So protective factors and risk factors can have to do with internal things, personality traits, your disposition, your sense of optimism or hope. Can relate to spirituality or religion. It can relate to things like coping mechanisms, how you get through the day, what works for you. It can relate to other opportunities for generativity, your employment, keeping a home. It can relate to relationships, your support systems. So protective and risk factors can be related to those things. It also can be issues related to physical or mental health. It's just a very broad idea that I think is really important as a takeaway, because we all possess things that are protective, but things that also can put us at risk, internal and external. The other thing that's a bit more related to social work practice and resilience is micro, meso, and macro level interventions. The reason I bring this up is that it would be deceptive of me to tell you that if you just walk out of here with a couple coping strategies, you're going to be fine. Right? Yeah, exactly. It's not true. Because there's things that we can do individually, but there's things that we need the world around us either to participate in or to support us in, to come alongside us. So for professional caregivers, individuals who work for an organization or an agency, one of the big issues right now being researched is how does the organizational culture and the health of the organization affect individual workers' performance and individuals' experience of compassion fatigue. This is huge. I think that there's a lot of really good traction related to this concept, and it really looks at how do organizations re-traumatize workers, re-traumatize clients, even not meaning to. Certainly we don't want to do that. But do we have an organization that's essentially unwell? And how do we create an organization in which there's a culture of wellness? So that's some emerging research, and that would be more of a macro level. It's a bigger level. There's larger change. Having organizations like Iowa City Hospice in Iowa City is a macro level intervention, because we're saying, hey, here is support, here are resources, here's information. This is what we can offer you as individuals, as families, etc. Meso level are more those medium level, like family level interventions. And so for many of you, the caregiving you do is within the family. Even if your caregiving is outside of the family, your family is probably affected by your caregiving roles. So thinking about a very flexible definition of family, I want to be clear here. For some of you, maybe family are your closest friends. Family might be a partner. or a spouse. And so when we talk about family, please know I'm thinking about family in the broadest sense. And what can we do at a family level? Many of us who work in the field of helping professionally, our families have to sort of get some things about what we do. Huge issue is confidentiality. So if I'm at the store and I run into a client and that client comes up and says, "Hi, Emily, how are you doing?" My family's pretty well trained to not ask me any questions about strangers who come up and talk to me, right? My family has adapted to my professional role and understanding that if they ask me anything about that person, I'm not going to be able to tell them. And they accept that. It's a little bit harder for younger kids. Well, my mommy, who was that? But the older ones get it, right? My partner gets it. And so just as we adapt in those situations, we as a family sometimes have to adapt to the individual and communal caregiving roles that are going on. Many of these other things are probably straightforward, right? Rest, nutrition, exercise, things that help you cope, relax, maintain your own personal level of wellness. There's 2 items on here that I want to talk a little bit about: self-care and self-awareness. There's a lot in the literature about how self-awareness and self-care are absolutely critical to combating compassion fatigue. First of all, you have to be aware of yourself. You have to be aware of your behaviors. You have to be aware of how you're reacting. You have to be aware of your own emotions, the dynamic that's maybe happening in your relationships that could be related to your caregiving roles. So that self-awareness is huge. And sometimes our closest family members and friends need to be the people who help us develop that self-awareness. It's like when you come home from work and you're slamming all the kitchen cupboards and you're just like this, and your partner comes home and says, "Did you have a bad day?" And you're like, "No." Right? And we might not even notice some of the things sometimes. And so the people closest to us can help us say, "Hey, I know you're saying you didn't have a bad day, but it kind of looks like you had a bad day. Do you want to talk about that? Do you need some time to yourself? How about we don't worry about dinner tonight? Let's go out." Right? Does that make sense? So that some of that self-awareness, we hope that we can identify it, but frankly, we may not see it all. We might need other people to help point that out to us. Likewise, self-care. Now, self-care for you and self-care for me might be 2 very different things. It's what works for you. Now, finding out what works for you is a part of self-awareness, and that can be very tricky, right? Some of us exercise as a part of self-care. Some of us do crafting. Some of us do community service. Some of us do gardening. There's so many aspects of self-care and what that means to the individual. Perhaps that you go get a massage once a month, or you savor your time when you go to your hair person for a new cut and color or what have you. So it's very individualized, and I could not prescribe for you what self-care looks like for you, because that has to be something that is meaningful to you. Not what you think should be meaningful to you. It's what is meaningful to you. And so oftentimes there has to be an experimentation. How does this work? Is this going to help me? One of the ways that many people are using the new uptick in interest in mindfulness is to see if that's an area that might give you benefit. Again, we could do a whole week-long seminar on mindfulness, and thankfully there are so many resources here in Iowa City that are outstanding places for information. But even just learning simple mindfulness-based stress reduction tools like a body scan, deep breathing. I can send you the links. You can find them online. You can find YouTube videos that will just provide the audio for a body scan or for meditations. This has certainly gotten a lot more attention in a variety of fields related to mental health and well-being, not just compassion fatigue. But compassion fatigue researchers strongly support mindfulness techniques as a very useful tool in combating compassion fatigue. That might connect to yoga or other sorts of mind-body connections. I watched a video on the Iowa City Hospice page of a person doing a mind-body technique related to health and wellness, and maybe that would be of benefit endless grace, is that what it was called?
Ageless
Grace, endless ageless. So it's that idea that those things can become a part of our daily life, that through practice they provide a sense of well-being, and we're doing some self-care in that. Likewise, there are some structured tools that we can offer, assessments, screenings. There are many resources available. It's really finding what might be the most meaningful and helpful to the individual at that time. One resource that I think is fantastic is a book called The Compassion Fatigue Workbook, and it's written by a woman named Françoise Mathieu, and she's French-Canadian. I heard her speak in January, and I think she's got a lot of great ideas. She is a part of the collaboration among researchers and professionals who are researching compassion fatigue, secondary traumatic stress, vicarious trauma, things that are related to burnout in caregiving. And so this workbook, I don't recall the cost. It was not cost prohibitive. It was just an excellent resource. She also has some online resources that are available as well. Something that I took from the Green Cross, which is an organization which Françoise Mathieu is a part, is this quote: "First, do no harm to yourself in the line of duty when helping or treating others. Second, attend to your physical, social, emotional, and spiritual needs as a way of ensuring high-quality services to those who look to you for support as a human being." I thought that summed it up really nicely. So if we're not taking care of ourselves, we're not doing anybody any favors. Certainly not ourselves, but also the people for whom we're giving care. So I want to offer some considerations. Some of these things I've already alluded to, but also I want to offer you some ideas about personal reflection. You know, spending some time maybe thinking about these topics. How do they relate to you, to what you're doing? Perhaps there's somebody that you can confide in who could give you some feedback about this. It might be a colleague, a friend, whomever that is, a trusted companion, a therapist. It could be many different people who could give you some feedback about what they're observing and hearing from you. Sometimes just paying attention, noticing how you're responding in situations, what gives you a sense of well-being, what raises your stress level. Are there things that you can cut out of your life that are really unnecessary, that actually increase your stress, that increase your sense of exhaustion? So I think that's very difficult, because many of us say, well, I can't give that up and I can't get that up. We're probably a lot of yes people here, where we're like, oh yeah, I'll do that, or that sounds great, or yeah, I'd be happy to help with that. And sometimes we have to do a very difficult inventory of what things really we can pause on and say, you know what, I'd love to be involved with that right now, but I can't right now. Consider me in a year, consider me in a different time frame. There's a term called flow. Maybe you've heard of it before. It's that experience of losing ourselves in something, where the world sort of falls away. We're not having all these cognitions in spite of doing something else. This is something we're all terrible at. Interestingly, I don't see any of your phones out, but you know, if we were in a public place, how many of us would have our phones in our hands and be looking at our phone while we're having a conversation, or while we're eating dinner, or while we're walking, or whatever, right? This continuous partial attention that we say is multitasking and actually helps us be more efficient. Well, I mean, maybe it is, maybe it's not. But flow means that you're fully in the moment, and you're experiencing joy being fully in the moment of something. If I could give a gift to each of you, it'd be that you know what provides you that flow experience, and you get to experience it as often as possible. So I'm a runner. If I'm lucky, and usually it goes that way, I get to experience a sense of flow when I'm running. And that's why I'm a runner, is that it does that for me. And I like that. And I need that. So that's one of the things that provides that for me in this time in my life. But that might be different in 5 years or in 10 years. And so that's why we have to constantly pay attention, because maybe something we have done in the past has provided that experience for us, but it doesn't really anymore. We might need to look for other alternatives that can create that flow experience for us, where we can be fully present in the moment, just for the moment it is, not worrying about anything else in the world going on around us. So practicing. If you're finding maybe something that is working, sort of working, keep practicing. One of my favorite terms once I started doing yoga was the idea that it's a practice. It's a yoga practice. You read and hear some of that in mindfulness too, that it's a practice, that meditation is a practice. It's not something that you ever achieve or you win or you finish, right? It's a practice. It's a process. And I like that idea here, is that you want to find something that can become just a part of your life, and that might provide you some relief, a sense of well-being or wellness to combat compassion fatigue. The last bullet point there, I would say to you, if you're doing okay, then keep doing what you're doing, right? If it ain't broken, there's nothing to fix. So if you're doing well in your caregiving roles, if you're managing it, if you're like, yeah, compassion fatigue is interesting, but that's not really where I'm at, well, great, good. So what if you're doing it, then keep doing it. But if it is broken, or it's not working, or you do feel fatigue, then let's find something. Let's find something that can maybe make a difference and start practicing. So there are some of us that when people are stressed out around us, it's like we absorb it like a sponge, right? It's like we just suck it in and we own it. I think this is definitely related to empathy, right? Is that we have no trouble understanding what the stress is for that person. So you want to create a time where you aren't susceptible to absorbing that stress. And that doesn't mean that you should isolate yourself, right? That's not what I'm saying. It just means that you need a buffer. You need something to buffer that so that you're not constantly consuming other people's stress. And if you are around it or consuming it or absorbing it, you find a way to discharge it, to release it, to let it go, if you will. So, some of you may be familiar with the movie Frozen. I can't imagine you're not. It's popular in my house because I have a 3-year-old. And the famous song, Let It Go, right? Let it go. Well, it's cliche, but another popular comparison could be Taylor Swift's Shake It Off. Just shake it off. Just shake it off. There's some benefit to that, right? Like, okay, I just don't want to think about that anymore. I'm going to just shake it off. So a little bit more related to research, not Frozen and Taylor Swift, is something called low impact debriefing. This is something that is taken from the Compassion Fatigue Workbook, where they can give you a much more comprehensive view of what this looks like. It's also called low impact disclosure, so you'll see it sometimes low impact disclosure or low impact debriefing. And this is a process by which you participate in just getting something off your chest. Low impact debriefing means that if I wanted to talk about something that was bothering me, and I just needed to get it off my chest. I just had to throw it up, if you will, right? Just get it out. And I wanted to maybe talk to Tori because she's right here. I'm like, okay, Tori's right here and she seems pretty nice and, she works for hospice, so she's probably a good person to talk to. I would first ask Tori, is it okay if I share something with you that's really upsetting me? Or that happened today with a client? Or that happened today with whomever you're doing caregiving for? Or whatever it is. It doesn't even have to be related to caregiving. And Tori would have the opportunity to say, yep, you go for it, Emily. Or she might say, you know what, now's not a great time. Can we chat later? Or can I catch you after this? So it's fair warning. You're basically asking permission to unload something on somebody else. And then after fair warning, you then make sure that that person is consenting to whatever it is that you want to get off your chest. And then once you have consent, you can say, okay, this is the gist of it, or this is the summary. You do not rehash every traumatic, gory detail. So I want you to put yourself in the position of somebody who deals with individuals who've experienced significant trauma on a daily basis. So from 8 to 5, let's say every day, you're dealing with a lot of loss, a lot of trauma. You have people in crisis who are coming to see you, who are maybe looking to you to fix it, to help them, to alleviate the stress and trauma. And oftentimes we can't fix it, right? I have a magic wand, a kid's magic wand, hanging by my desk that a child gave me 7 or 8 years ago. And she said, I think if you have this magic wand, I think you'll be able to help my family get a baby. I worked in adoption. And I said, well, I don't really think that magic wand's going to help. Oh, yeah, it will. And she insisted that I take it with me. And her parents were like, just take it. It was a dollar store wand. And I've kept it. Because guess what? We don't have the magic wand, do we? We don't have it. We can't just fix it. And I sure wish sometimes I had that power, because you see pain, suffering, hurt, fear, all those things. So when we do limited disclosure, we don't get into every gory detail. We get it off our chest, we sum it up, we thank the person for the opportunity, we hopefully receive support from that person that we shared, and that's it. So it's low impact disclosure, low impact debriefing. We're not rehashing every single thing about, and this happened, and then she said this, and then he did this, and then I had to do that, and then the doctor said this, and we're not doing that. Okay? So low impact debriefing or low impact disclosure can work in professional contexts, but it also can work in personal contexts. And so many of us who work as professional helpers, we might feel like, oh gosh, I just had this awful day and I can't really talk about it to my partner or my spouse or my friend because of confidentiality. And so there might be times where you're like, oh my gosh, I had this client today and she told me about childhood sexual abuse, and I feel like yuck. I feel like I feel just awful. I feel like I need to take a shower. But that's all we can say, right? That's all we can say. We can't go into the details. We can't reveal anything that could put that person's confidentiality or privacy at risk. And there'll be many times where maybe you're doing personal caregiving and you don't want people to know maybe everything, right? You don't want them to know everything about that the person you're providing care for. But you need to get a little bit off your chest. You just got to share a little bit about how awful it was or how upsetting it was or what that meant to you. So perhaps low impact debriefing or low impact disclosure is something that you can find somebody to practice with. Is that maybe there can be a person in your life where you sort of get this, like this is sort of like, you're like, okay, yes, let's do with fair warning, disclosure, that type of thing. Other times you can just do it informally, right? This is something we can easily do with anybody, but we're just more careful and conscientious about the process of disclosure. There's something that called an Ecomapping, which is an idea that is out of ecosystem research, the ecological approach, where we do sort of a self-assessment of our lives and we chart it out visually. So it'd be as if you were sort of like the center of a circle, and you're charting out who are all the people, organizations, roles, connections you have in your ecosystem, if you will, like in your environment. And when I mean in your environment, it can be your psychological environment and your physical environment. Things, activities, people, things to which you're connected. So if I were going to do an Ecomap, I would put information about my partner, my children, my parents, my sibling and her family, my work, my activities, my community involvement. Does that make sense? So you're kind of charting out aspects of your life, your environmental life. And one of the interesting things you can do with eco-mapping is you can draw flows of energy or reflect how do these flows of energy work? What do I give energy to, and what do I receive energy from? You can think about energy in terms of time, but I think energy is a better term because sometimes we spend very little time at something or doing something, but it takes enormous energy. And likewise, we might spend a lot of time doing something, but it doesn't take a lot of our energy. So look for the things that you give energy to that give very little back. Look for the things that give you a lot of energy, but really take very little from you. And then it's important to look at what things are fairly equal. You can look at your relationships. And so that's when we do eco-mapping, some people will put individuals, like they'll break down, they won't put parents, they'll put mom and dad, or stepdad, or Grandma Rose, or whomever, right? It's about individuals because the flows of energy are different person to person and over time, right? Relationships, things that maybe give you a lot of energy at some point, suck it out other times, and vice versa. And so this would be a way to do a self-assessment that anybody can do. You can Google eco maps and you'll get a gazillion examples. Some people use eco maps to draw like family trees. That's not really what I'm thinking about here. It's more of just an opportunity to look at your ecosystem, your environmental systems or people. Another thing I want to offer you is 2 feet, 1 breath. This is related to research that was done with physicians, actually, and it's a mindfulness technique. So if you want to look at the article, the New York Times had an article about this research that's really well done, and that's where I got my information that linked me to the actual research. And my interpretation of the research is that physicians, and I think resident physicians, were coached to practice this very simple mindfulness technique before they would enter an encounter with a new patient or a different patient, right? So instead of just going patient to patient to patient to patient, before they would enter, let's say, an exam room, they think of my 2 feet on the ground and 1 breath before they enter the room. So it takes like 5 seconds to do. But it's a way of managing one's focus, one's attention, in a very brief period of time. Another technique that is a pop culture technique, again, it's another pop culture reference, is there's a show on Netflix. Netflix is a video streaming and video service. There's a show that was produced just by Netflix called The Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt. And it's pretty funny if you're interested. I don't get any kickback for that. But there is something that Kimmy says, which is that I just have to get through the next 10 seconds at a time. And she'll count to 10, and then she'll go again. And then she'll count. She'll be continuously counting when she's in a stressful situation. I'm like, that's brilliant, right? Because most things in life are temporary, which is the greatest. It's so unfortunate because all the wonderful things in our life we want to be permanent, right? We want to always feel those wonderful feelings, but they're usually temporary. But all the rotten stuff is pretty temporary too. And so keeping in mind, if I can do little things to get through tough moments, whether it's 2 feet, 1 breath, whether it's just counting, getting through the next 10 or 16 seconds, then what works for you, do it. Do it. And if people think you're a little loony, a little crazy, who cares? If it gets you through, if it's how you are demonstrating and manifesting resilience, do it. And maybe people around you will do it too. Tori, how am I at time? Do you know?
You've been speaking for 45 minutes.
Okay. That's awesome. So these are just some reflection questions, not that you need to answer publicly or to anyone, but just maybe as takeaway. I know that we can't simply eliminate the things that stress us out. I'm certainly in no way believing that that's the case, but I think what we can do is identify, prioritize, and consider, how can I cope with this stressful situation in a different way? How can this be managed in a different way? Sometimes that helps to have a conversation. Sometimes it can be a conversation with ourselves about it. Sometimes it's a conversation we can have with a personal friend, but sometimes it can be a conversation we need to have with somebody who's really objective, a professional, whether it's a counselor, a therapist, whomever. who can really just give us some constructive feedback, reflect what we're saying, reflect what we're feeling. Funny cartoon yes. Looking at ways that you cope that maybe aren't very helpful, right? Or that might cause their own problems. Identifying that's really not working that great. So, to end, what I want to challenge you is through these steps. First, to assess. Do some reflection, some self-assessment. Look for ways that you can enhance balance in your life, whether that's work-life balance, life-life balance, whatever that means for you. Balance, that you feel balanced. Develop resiliency skills. People will notice. People will learn from you. They will see how does that person get through that? How do they manage that? Well, you know what? This is what helps me manage it. It's not that I'm superhuman. It's that this stuff works for me. And so I do it. And it helps. It's a practice. It's a commitment. And that's step 4, is that you commit to change. You commit to a practice that works for you. That no one person can prescribe for you. You have to know that it's efficacious for you. And our final activity is just an opportunity for those of you who are in the room. Tori will pass around a box. There are a variety of note cards note cards, I guess they are. If you would like to take one and write yourself a note or write down an idea based on today's presentation that you think is a takeaway for you, I want to give you that opportunity. And then perhaps save it and ask somebody to mail it to you in a week, a month, or put it somewhere where you can see it. Do this if it's meaningful for you, as a reminder of something that you want to take with you about compassion fatigue and enhancing compassion satisfaction and minimizing the impact of compassion fatigue. So I'd love to take any questions if anybody wants to ask.
I had a couple of questions. One, you had talked about some macro research, and I was wondering if you had some names of who
Yes.
that was from.
There's one option that's available called the sanctuary model. Pretty sure if you Google the sanctuary model, you're going to find it. If you want to provide like an email address at the end of the session, I'd also be happy to email that to you, that link. The sanctuary model is an idea related to organizational health that has spread across a lot of mental health or psychiatric settings, with the whole idea of psychiatric settings at times being re-traumatizing to patients and therefore traumatizing to the workers as well. Another name I would offer you for research, a person who's doing some of the most current stuff, is Kyle Killian. And I will double check that at the end of the session as well. He has developed research with multiple institutions and also done some research regarding communities' response to trauma. So like a community-wide trauma, flooding, natural disasters, shootings, other community violence, and looking at how can communities manage that. So Kyle Killian is a name I would offer to you there. Matthew, who I mentioned earlier, the author of this book, she also has started to address more of organizational strategies. There is a section of this book that touches on that, but I've also seen her cited in other information related to organizational health and wellness. So those are some suggestions for you. Can you say another question?
I have a question about one of your first points, that nearly all folks universally experience an ebb and flow of fatigue. And what about other cultures, ones that are completely different from the kind of Anglo American European model? These all seem very, very American to me. Have you personally, I'm sure that there are other people who talk about this, but have you personally taken things directly from other cultures that can be experienced here?
That is a great question. And something that I think would be really helpful to learn more about. Francois Mathieu is a Canadian, and so she even had some things that I thought were a bit of a different perspective. I mean, not terribly different, but I thought that was a helpful perspective. She also referenced things about social norms and cultural norms that I think can't be taken for granted here, which is that if it is your social or cultural norm to give care in a particular way, that those individuals might have a different sort of resilience because they accept it as a different kind of normal. And it's not that they're born with a different resilience, I don't mean that, but that essentially that's practiced from one's whole life. That grandma's always lived with us, or that great-grandma's always lived with us. So you look at how families are constructed and who is considered a household or a family. But as to different strategies, I think you're spot on. I think this is a very Western ideal here, or idea. And that would be something I think that we should take a deeper look into, is how do different cultures experience it.
Yeah, if it can be translated practically.
Yeah.
Some things like maybe eating crickets to combat stress. That's not gonna.
I hope that isn't a solution, because I'm not interested in that one.
Trying to kind of come up with very silly things, but
Sure.
Okay. And then just to make sure I have this right, when you talked about a body scan, is that simply being aware of your fingertips and the shafts of your fingers?
Precisely.
Okay.
Yeah, and so I probably should have clarified that. I introduced that idea to students, and they looked at me like, "What are you saying we have to do? A body scan?" But yes, it's the experience of being mindful of the parts of your body. So feeling your breath in your chest, thinking about that breath going down your left leg. Feeling it through your knee, your calf, exactly. So it's that really paying attention to the different sensations throughout your body.
I simply, as a caregiver myself who shares caregiving responsibilities, I appreciate all of your suggestions, and I think my siblings and I all do very different ways of coping, and but I guess I'm just, what do you do with like the very last one, the last stressor that you just can't seem to get rid of? Just let it go, or
I don't think it's usually that simple.
yeah.
And so
you're not going to say, you said you're not going to be able to give us all the tools and techniques, and
I
we'll
think
walk out of here,
But if you feel like there's something that's especially burdensome, that it's just consistently burdensome, the thorn in a side, for example, right? You just can't get rid of it. Something in my experience I've done with a lot of clients is like, let's just try to look at it from a different angle. Like, let's reposition this. What's an alternative narrative? This is how you're experiencing it. How can we shift the focus? How can we find meaning? How can we find purpose? And that sounds a little spiritual, but it doesn't necessarily have to be spiritual in a conventional sense.
Right.
How do you make sense of this? And so I think that that's something that can be done through conversation. I think it's something that can be done through reflection, whether that's journaling or poetry or whatever that means to the individual. But I would say don't give up hope that it's something you can manage. It's just maybe that the way you've tried to manage it thus far hasn't been as easy as you hoped.
Well, yeah, it's just there's just I guess you would call it the ebb and flow as well, and
Yep.
and that I'm glad I just have this one particular sticking thing rather than things that I revisit over and over and over again. But thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I was just hoping to get some more clarification on minimal debriefing.
Mhm.
Were you suggesting that because in the essence of time, it's a nice, easy, fast way to do some debriefing? Or were you suggesting that because of vicarious trauma, we shouldn't go into the details, even though we might think it's in our best interest?
Both. Both. So the way that I understand low impact debriefing is that you might feel the need to rehash whatever it is that you've heard, seen, experienced, and you want to do it, over an hour or a half hour, or just, you're not probably thinking in terms of time. You're thinking like, I just got to get this out. I got to get this off my chest. And that in terms of vicarious traumatization, that's exactly what you're putting that other person at risk for. And if you follow this here, some people feel like this gets a little too Freudian, but if we sort of absorb, if we're getting vicariously traumatized by what our clients or whomever in our life are experiencing, I'll put it in a client context. So we're hearing traumatic stories day in, day out, and we're seeing pain and suffering and maladaptive behavior as a result. And we might have a sense of helplessness as a helper or a caregiver of really fixing it. We're just trying to sort of cover it up with as many Band-Aids as we can so the person doesn't bleed out. We can take on that trauma and experience secondary traumatic stress, vicarious traumatization. What's interesting about some of the research is that, and what Francois Mathieu would say is, you can spread that to other people if you're not careful. And it comes out of you, which is the idea of organizations being traumatizing, which is that the workers absorb that trauma so much that they re-traumatize new patients, new clients, new workers, so that we're all sick in our own way. I don't mean ill, unwell, not well. Does that make sense? And so it absolutely relates to vicarious traumatization. Is it really necessary to tell all the details? But it's also about time, because time is one of our most valuable resources. If you put this in a professional context again, we barely have time for what we would call supervision, right? Where we actually have a constructive conversation with our manager or our supervisor about practice issues. How are we really going to have time to dissect a case? That sort of supervision is just like incredibly valuable, but so elusive, very hard to get because we all have such high caseloads, high demands. We have to do all of our documentation, blah, 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 blah. And so it is time limited for a purpose, 5 to 7 minutes. So does that answer your question?
Well, thank you everyone for your questions, and thank you, Emily. Wonderful,
Yeah.
wonderful presentation.
Thanks, Tori.